And we stay in the good graces of the administration, and we move on.
Down with that?
Yep.
That's great.
Good,
It's clever.
thank you.
Clever. That's our goal.
And
Thank
no
you.
new language to draft?
Right.
That
Hey,
too.
hey, not yet.
That sounds fine.
Just this thus far.
Great.
There was one change.
Oh, I will be drafting, don't worry.
Well, yes, but also.
Downright breezy.
Oh, yeah.
Do we get to Paul's question?
We need to get to, and there's a bill on the wall, I think, that addresses a town that goes from a 10 acre, 1 acre, other way around, 1 acre to 10
Oh.
acre.
I don't think you have it on the wall.
Oh, okay, but there's language that is requested
Yep.
somewhere. I think, can you explain to us the process? Do you remember how that would work?
So, right, Representative Lefebvre was alluding to this. So, there are permits that exist for projects that are on less than 10 acres in towns that are now 10 acres. So, there have been bills in previous sessions to not require those to get permit amendments. So there's a policy choice between, do you want to have them be eligible for release from jurisdiction or just not have them require a permit amendment unless and until they meet the jurisdictional trigger of 10 acres.
So this could apply to them. They could apply for this.
No.
No?
No, because this is talking about change of use. So this is talking about, a commercial development on, let's say, 3 acres in what used to be a 1 acre town. And they needed to get a permit because they're on 3 acres and that's more than 1 acre. But then their town developed bylaws, and so now they are a 10 acre town. So if they were becoming a commercial development now, they wouldn't need a permit.
But it's conceptually the same thing. Their development would no longer have triggered Act 250, which is exactly what this is. Their development no longer triggers Act 250.
So I think conceptually they are similar, but the word is change of use, right? So I could change this language.
Where's change of use?
Yeah.
So that's so I'm on page 66, line 17. Yeah, the use of the land as of the date of application is not the same as the use of the land that caused the obligation.
Yeah. Well, does it make sense to have this do both? Because the intent seems the same. But okay, so anyway, how did that bill do it?
So that bill had in the permit amendment section, so no permit amendment would be required for one of those permits unless they triggered Act 250 in a different way. So if they remain the same and they're still just on the 3 acres,
This is Representative Toll's language.
yes. So
Who decides no permit amendment is needed?
well, so by putting it in you would add that language,
At which language?
but it would say no permit amendment is needed.
I know, but I think we've taken testimony that the list of towns that are 1 acre and 10 acre is not always so straightforward. Like, who decides that?
So the NRB decides that, and they do keep a list.
Sort of
And
an advisory list.
So Evan can jump in, but I think what Evan said last week was that someone can challenge that. But
So Evan Meenan from the NRB. So what I tried to explain earlier was that there is no set statutory mechanism for establishing the 1 acre, 10 acre town list that the NRB maintains. Theoretically, that whether or not something triggers jurisdiction because it's a 1 acre, 10 acre town would just get decided as part of the jurisdictional opinion process, but or the enforcement context. But that doesn't provide a lot of guidance for the community. So the Natural Resources Board on its own took it upon itself to come up with this non-binding 1 acre, 10 acre town list. And a town can reach out to the board and express an opinion that they're listed incorrectly, and then the board would undergo an analysis, and I have done this, undergo an analysis to figure out which column the municipality should be in. But again, that is not, the creation of that list is not in and of itself a jurisdictional opinion. So in the context of any specific jurisdictional opinion, a coordinator could discover some new fact since the list was created that would change things, and they could issue a jurisdictional opinion that says a project is in a 1 acre town, even if the board thought that it should be included in the 10-acre town column on the list. In other words, we just do this because we think it's helpful for people, not because there's a statutory mechanism for doing it, or we have the specific authority to do it, or that it's binding on anyone. It's just a planning tool for people.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So, how does jurisdiction be removed? Does the property owner require or make an appeal given the change in circumstances, or is it the town that makes the request, or how does it get initiated? Who initiates saying that this property no longer is required to be under 250 because of changes in circumstances? I just don't understand who initiates it, or how what are the steps, for example?
Well, we just, under the language in the bill would be the property owner.
I didn't hear that.
Under the language we just reviewed before the break, it's the property owner would make that case to the district coordinator. I think we just decided as a JO.
Yep.
And I'm thinking there's a lot of parallels between town changing from 1 acre to 10 acre.
I always thought I was hearing the board, not the district coordinator.
You did decide to have the decision go to the board, but yeah.
But why would we?
Maybe it should be the district coordinator.
Yeah.
If we just, I mean, Jim just made the case that it's a jurisdictional opinion. If you had sort of a change of a jurisdictional opinion. Is that right?
Yeah.
Jim?
Well, I'm thinking, I mean, when we say district commission, that includes the coordinator. The coordinator does make jurisdictional opinions for the district commission. This is clearly a jurisdictional opinion request by the applicant, by the present permittee, for release. And we've heard several examples of total changes of use that are no longer the same as the use of the land that caused the obligation to obtain a permit, line 18. So there's that. Under the 1 acre to 10 acre, it's similar, but similar means it's different. And I think that's it. And the difference is they got the same use as the same Dollar General, for instance, or the same Dick's Sporting Goods, if you could fill it all in under 10 acres. And I think that's another issue that makes this otherwise pretty simple, straightforward. Hello, they're not using the land that caused the obligation. So I could be convinced to just add some sort of language that says, and 1 acre to 10 acre town, and but I haven't written that in my mind yet. Somebody may have. I like it the way it is.
Matt,
I mean, I'm not sure, I don't think it's one or the other.
No, it's not.
Right, okay.
No, it definitely is not.
But in my mind, it's, you know, it seems to make sense if you're, you know, the point was to have the 1 acre and 10 acre breakout. You know, there's wisdom in that decision. I don't see how it can't be. You know, I don't, you know, I can see, you know, I can see the rationale we're saying. If you're now, you know, a 10 acre town and you don't fall into that until you get to 10 acres, you know, that makes a lot of sense to me on the face of it.
So-
And I don't know the rationale to say why it shouldn't be that way.
right, so I think we agree. So what I think I'm gonna say is, Ellen, please go forth and hear that we're sort of seeing these as jurisdictional opinion in reverse. You know, you're asking like, hey, I don't think we are subject to this anymore. And if you could just bring us language back that does both of these things, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing? Not about changing,
Okay, go
but
ahead.
regarding the district commission may release the land. And I'm concerned about district commissions doing JOs, 'cause, so.
We
that's
decided
not-
they're not.
Oh,
The
good, all
boards.
right.
The district coordinator will continue to do jurisdictional opinions.
Okay.
But do we want this, if we're calling it a JO, is it the district coordinator and then it's appealable to the board like other JOs? Is that where we are right now on this one?
Are we making this, the change that all JOs are appealable to the board as opposed to, because now they're appealable to only the environmental court,
Yeah, to the board.
to the board of fire.
Okay, so district coordinator for now. Let's just go with that, appealable to the board.
Yay.
Let's go. This is bottom of 67, mitigation of prime ag sales.
Forest-based enterprises can mitigate 1-to-1 on prime ag soils.
I think we agreed to that. Yep.
Alright, so now look, we're gonna skip over a bunch of pages.
Well, so, but this, language is,
Is out.
well, except that it may guide the rulemaking process for forest fragmentation, so it may be in 8 still, right? I mean, that was where it came from, right?
Right. Do you wanna pursue having a statutory section related to mitigation, or do you wanna just have the board create?
Rules, but if this helps inform those rules, to the extent this articulates legislative intent, then it could help guide that rulemaking process. So when you consider that language change, I don't know, I mean,
No, that's well said.
this language came probably from,
233. But
yeah, but I'm wondering where 233 got it from originally. What's the thought?
That was the beginning.
So it sets out the formula for calculating the mitigation.
Right. Yes.
And maybe we should have mentioned this back when we talked about forest blocks, but this just sort of triggered it as to whether we want to flag that all projects that involve forest blocks or connected habitat or ridge lines will be deemed major. Not minor projects.
I don't know what that does, actually.
It triggers the major.
Well, I
But
understand that.
the public hearing, it just, we can't just, you know, sometimes the problems with NEPA, the federal model, often or occasionally you get significant projects that end up only being evaluated under an environmental assessment as opposed to an environmental impact statement,
Right.
which is a more rigorous process. Similarly, we're setting up this dichotomy of minor projects that aren't really defined and major projects that at least have a hearing. And this kind of flags the value of, I think, forest blocks, connected habitat, and ridge lines is warranting
So,
a higher evaluation.
to be clear, Evan, pretty sure there's a process by which a minor can have a hearing and stay a minor, right?
No, it effectively just becomes a major.
Yeah, I thought I read last night in my readings that there were some, you could have a hearing and still decide it was a minor. No, okay. Good to clear that up. Okay. Do we need the mitigation language in our bill now that we wanna go to rulemaking for it? Jim?
I'd like to be prescriptive to make certain that what our intent is gets considered in the rulemaking. And that gives a ledge to stand on for Elcar if the rules didn't do that or did something different. And so, yeah, I think, and I was just trying to see where we would want to stop being prescriptive in this strikeout language, but.
Yeah, I think,
But I like saying, we want rules and we want them to address these specific concerns.
yeah, do these rules come from wetlands mitigation, or does anyone in the room have a sense of where this has come from? Jamey?
Yeah, I believe it was
Or ag?
an attempt in the beginning to, look at the language in particular. I mean, I think it basically just laid out a process that, I think some of it was based off of the fact that there was precedent for prime agricultural soils, and you had VHCB, for example, that had a mitigation bank available. I'm trying to remember how prescriptive this language was. I do think, and this is just a suggestion, that the rulemaking language that I think Ellen and the agency was trying to come up with is in the spirit of trying to follow some of this without having all these details in there, but to basically understand that the process that's being laid out needs to be covered in the rulemaking.
Yeah.
And so I think there would be some redundancy if you leave this in, or at least it would have to somehow sync. This was, but I think the spirit of what's in here is still desired, that there has to be a process laid out, understanding how the mitigation will work. This was, I think I do recall, and I'll let Matt speak to this, that the agency or Billy had some concerns with on-site versus off-site mitigation, and perhaps this was getting too prescriptive outside of some of the practice they have in other settings implementing mitigation. And the desire was to articulate that in a rulemaking.
We know the agency has mitigation already set up for prime habitat.
The necessary wildlife
Necessary
habitat.
wildlife
Yeah.
habitat. Warren, do you want to add something?
All I was going to say is, when you see the language that we worked on to specify the rulemaking, you can sort of cross-check it with this and see if we think we've got the elements, we have things in there like ratios, sort of on and off site, those, I think the general concepts, like Jamey said, I think you can sort of look at the language we drafted and see if we've omitted anything that you feel is critical and added it to the language that we're making.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, we're now leaving Act 250. The statute.
No.
We're gonna get into the other small things that are outside of Chapter 151. So, Section 127 of Title 10, resource mapping. Do you want to keep this language? So, the Secretary of Natural Resources shall complete and maintain resource mapping based on GIS and other technology. The mapping shall identify natural resources throughout the state, including forest blocks, that may be relevant to the consideration of energy projects and projects subject to Chapter 151. The Center for Geographic Information shall be available to provide assistance to the Secretary in carrying out resource mapping. There was conversation around this language originally that it shouldn't be limited to GIS based only, as there are newer technologies also. So on line 3, page 71, the Secretary shall consider the resource maps developed under Section A when providing evidence and recommendations to the PUC, and when commenting on or providing recommendations under Chapter 151, that's 250. Line 9, the Secretary shall establish and maintain written procedures that include a process and science-based criteria for updating resource maps developed under subsection A. Before establishing or revising these procedures, the Secretary shall provide opportunities for affected parties and the public to submit relevant information and recommendations.
This has been in our bill throughout.
Do we have a definition for affected parties? Not yet.
So this isn't a different, so we're in a different part of the title than I am used to, so I do not know off the top of my head. But potentially.
Parties, well, you're doing resource mapping.
Right.
How does the agency do resource mapping now? Do they notify affected parties? Who's an affected party in a resource map?
I don't believe I mean, we do some stakeholder outreach and education after the maps have been adopted. I don't think that we're bringing the stakeholders in during the outreach. Right.
I couldn't hear what was said.
Oh, so we do outreach to municipalities but we don't do a broader outreach effort.
I suspect that this has to do with forest blocks. So this is adding the
Just keep going. I'll tell them again. Go ahead.
So this is adding forest blocks to be required onto the maps, and I think that this was part of the conversation about if someone potentially wanted to object to having something being declared a forest block or mapped as a forest block.
It was part of 233, and I think there was recommendations by Aaron Adler that you need to have consistency, so for example, if people were relying on maps and all of a sudden they were taken offline, that they were just looking for some consistency in the availability information. So, to go go back and see how much it syncs now with the approach that's suggested by the agency. I think the rulemaking should cover what information should be available to the public and how it be maintained. Would that be one way to address it?
I guess I feel like resource mapping is not through rulemaking.
No, but I mean, if the intent is for this to be for Act 250 compliance with that criteria, if it has a broader application, then I guess you need to consider keeping it in.
Jim?
Well, it certainly appears to me, resource mapping forest blocks, and then subsection 127, we're on page 70. And I will only say that it's based on, or to speak to Paul's, who are these affected people? There isn't one of us. Flyovers have been happening for years to determine what our landscape looks like, and now we have GIS technology that we can add to that, and we now have LiDAR on top of that, which is in the other technology, and I'm betting nobody ever had to give permission to have somebody flying over and taking photographs of which this all sort of amounts to. And so for me, where was the word affected, or phrase?
Line 12.
Line 12,
Page 71.
affected parties. I think that needs to come out, actually.
I'm questioning the whole section because this is existing statute that directs the Agency of Natural Resources to maintain resource maps. And they're doing it now just fine. So I don't know why we're adding with it that we're going to require them to establish and maintain written procedures to do that. Do they already have those procedures now?
Yes.
Could they stop anytime they want to?
Well,
I think why we need it is on line 18, including forest blocks, because for some years now, the agency has told us, oh yeah, we got these great maps that identify forest blocks, but you can't use them. And I think, to me, this says we're doing it, and we're doing it in regard to mapping forest
indeed,
blocks.
that's true. I agree Section A does that. I'm talking about Section C.
I beg your pardon?
And Warren, you've been wanting to weigh in.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that your 233 in the definition of forest block actually referred to something that was mapped, and that is the tie-in to this section, which was your requirement to say, agency, you need to actually include forest blocks in your resource maps because we're defining forest block as something that is mapped.
Yeah.
So, without speaking to C, the agency can speak for itself. What I understand is they're not enamored with the idea of having maps, and I think there's a disagreement amongst us about the importance of having maps, at least as an initial indication to give somebody an idea of am I in or am I out. Not necessarily that it's ultimately the end-all be-all of jurisdiction, but to at least give the public or neighbors or anybody an idea of where I stand with regard to what I want to do and this new criteria.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of the background of it. The current definition that you have does not tie to maps, doesn't refer to a map. The language that we were kicking around the other day to give you in rulemaking, we didn't reach an agreement on that, and so I'm just putting that on the table for you. I think that's a fair characterization of why this is there, and it hit the background from 233 and then where we are today, and what you'll see in the language, and Matt can probably elaborate or correct me.
No, I mean, I basically agree with Warren. I'm not sure whether this is necessary per se. I think that, you know, the agency has a concern about using maps that were developed at a very coarse level, that were not intended to be used for jurisdictional type purposes, to basically use those maps in that way. I think they're an element that professionals use to help formulate an opinion on these types of things. So it's not to say they're not a relevant piece of evidence. I think that people put often too much emphasis on a map and use it as a sort of a dispositive tool, and that's not what these were created to be.
Well, there's an advisory wetlands layer that you guys use all the time to help people.
Sure.
So why is this different?
Well, I mean,
No,
I guess
it's actually
the
not
advisory wetlands layer is just that, right? We don't use it for jurisdictional purposes, and we ask people to go out and look at the features in the field to make decisions with respect to something, whether something is or isn't a wetland.
Right, but so forest blocks and habitat connectors are changing in the criteria, not the jurisdiction. There's no jurisdictional trigger here.
Understood.
Well, two of you just used the word jurisdiction. I want to be clear. It's criteria. So there's other reasons people are already in Act 250, and I'm hearing that maybe representatives from the business community would like some idea of how to make a determination.
So again, I think that's, you know, from the agency's perspective, I think having narrative standards in the rulemaking is in order to give the level of clarity that the business community Warren is looking for, is what we want to drive towards. We don't want to use maps as a surrogate for that.
I do. I want to use them in concert. Picture book always works for me. I like maps. We've been using them since Magellan's time. They weren't always the best, but just saying. And if they're not dispository, then what are we afraid of?
Well, again, I think this is one of the things that we've at least recommended that gets kicked to rulemaking, to find the best way for people to have an appreciation of how they're going to present evidence on these criteria. And we don't think that that a map is sort of the best way to do that. It's going to be a part of the process that we're probably going to recommend to the NRB that they look into, but it's not going to be the only thing. And I think from that perspective, right? I mean, I think that I'm not saying that don't ever look at the map, right? Like that they should be excluded from. I think it goes to the weight that they're given and how they're used in the process.
This through H233. I thought we had found our place of agreement when we did that bill without maps. Actually, seems crazy to say out loud, but that's what the agency wants. So I thought we found our place to that solution. So is this old language that was resurrected for this?
I don't think it was resurrected. I think just when the committee decided to kind of take maybe the 233 route, that carried through versus the other option of kind of, you know, adding no undue adverse effect to forest blocks and connectivity areas, and then having a rulemaking. Personally, I think maps are helpful, but we've also heard that the agency has developed a really strong mapping component to their work, and a lot of it is to promote conservation, but the goal wasn't to have them automatically all of a sudden become a regulatory tool and reduce the effectiveness of them for the efforts in conservation. And I think all along we've been trying to find a way to add clarity through definitions. I think maps would be a helpful component, but it may not be. I mean, conditions do change on the ground. There can be some debate about the limits of that block. Wildlife connectivity is going to change. It could be based on local inventories and not just the agency maps, and so I think there's a lot of different considerations, and that's
Parallels seem awfully similar to wetlands to me. People will say the same exact sentences you just said about wetlands and wetlands maps. And somehow we have the advisory layer that's there. It's gotta be helping people when we have it, and it gets updated and refined. Carrie, did you want to say something?
No, I think this is not a unique issue when it comes to natural resources. We use maps for advisory to help in, as you described, to help inform on a regulation, but also for project development. Maps need to evolve when more information becomes available. We always are limited by tools for topography and field data. So I don't think we have to be too worried about this question in my mind. I think when we have a state that's largely in private ownership, that requires kind of a relationship building with those landowners to see how maps can be informative and not necessarily cause any unnecessary angst about the information on those maps. So I personally am in the mindset that while we want to see the maps developed, because I think they're informative, similar to how we see how the wetland maps play out, that it's really difficult to, because of, for the reason I described, to make them part of a regulatory program. So I like how we want to see these maps occur, in other words, but in terms of its application, they should be more informative.
And what's your counterpoint to that? Do you have a counterpoint?
Yeah, my counterpoint is they should be a tool, and I'm spending significant state resources to develop them, and heretofore, regarding forest blocks, we're told, oh no, you can't use them. We spent this money to make them, but you can't use them. And that's bizarre. And I think maybe what the administration is trying to say, you can't use them as the definitive picture for a trigger for Act 250. But what I believe we should continue to upgrade those maps, and hey, it's existing language since 2013. We just added other technology. We are including forest blocks, and if that's what we're still discussing, I think it's not a problem. If we're discussing C, whether or not we keep C in or change it, I don't see how that actually speaks to whether or not they're going to end up being used as triggers either. And I think, so when we get to the rulemaking section that I think Matt is still going to be giving us, we just need to make certain that we say the maps are part of the pie. They're part of how we're going to make decisions around the rulemaking. And
Yeah,
so,
that's a good question. I appreciate us mentioning including forest blocks, but all along we've been talking about forest blocks, connected habitat, and ridge lines. I want to not lose sight of the value of those other features of the landscape in terms of what we're also indicating as priorities for this.
Which other?
Line 18 on page 70. We only mentioned including forest blocks. I don't want to lose sight of the opportunity to map where possible connected habitat.
Unfortunately, I think we took ridgelines out.
so again,
That one,
Yeah, it's gone.
connective habitat, yeah.
connected
Throw it in.
habitat, yes.
Excuse.
All right, I'm gonna say, let's leave this in. I think C doesn't belong because I've heard that we already have procedures for mapping. And I would say, let's leave this change in for now and see how the rulemaking language fits in with it, and, would it address the concerns of the interested parties in this room to say that these would be advisory? In the manner that wetlands maps are.
Mm-hmm.
Can we try that on?
We can try it on.
Let's try that on. Thank you. All right. So, okay. Enhanced designation appeal. We're not doing enhanced designations.
Yes, but it's so just I'm gonna talk you through it. What is happening now under your next iteration is that designated downtowns and neighborhood development areas are going to be exempt from Act 250 automatically. So, do you want the decision of receiving a designated downtown or neighborhood development area, that decision, do you want that to be appealable to anyone?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so, the Downtown Development Board makes that decision. That's what this language is on the bottom of page 71. So do you want that to go to the Natural Resources Board?
Yes.
Great. Municipal and regional planning.
Maybe just one question on that. Does it make sense for us to still call this exemptions and not rebuttable presumptions? Because what we're doing is setting up an opportunity to appeal. And the term exemption might imply full exemption when we are just describing the opportunity to rebut a presumption of yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I can tell you.
This was a comment that was raised by Conservation Law Foundation saying if you're having an appeal process, is that a rebuttable presumption and should we call it that? As opposed to thinking of it as in the context of exemption. I'm fine either way, I just throw that out.
Oh, so that's great. So that's different, right? So under what you have decided is that
Thank you.
what would currently be considered development, if it's located in a downtown, is exempt. So having it be a presumption is different.
Okay.
So, and so this is what is appealable is the
Designation.
the designation by the state board
Okay.
that an area is a downtown.
Thank you.
Alright, regional and municipal planning. So, page 72. This 24 VSA 4348. This is the regional map. And so this is the process, and I'm going to change the wording slightly, but it's having the Natural Resources Board review regional plans and approve them.
Because right now, nobody does.
Correct.
Okay.
Do you want to move on?
We like it.
Okay. Section 7. So this, I think, is coming out. So section 7 is about the elements of a regional map. In the
Right.
Regional plan.
elements of the map in the regional plan. And so you add language on page 74 to require on the map in the regional plan to map the critical resource areas.
Yeah, take it out.
Where's that?
With deep heartache, because I think this is the direction we should
On
really
page
be going.
74,
Um,
line 15.
yes, so I think sadly we need to take it out.
Taken it.
So we're not doing that approach.
You took out the definition of critical resource areas. Section 8, page 75, the municipal plan. Oh, sorry, this is the bottom of page 74. I'm rushing now. 24 VSA, 4382, so municipal plans. A plan for a municipality shall be consistent with the goals of 4302. Currently, it's only a may. Alright, so, page 75, I think we have already decided on this, but this is the language that sets up when so the exemption for downtowns and neighborhood development areas. This is the language that allows the appropriate municipal panel to extinguish the existing Act 250 permit and have them transfer conditions from the permit, from the Act 250 permit into the municipal permit. So I don't think we've made any changes since the last version.
We used this term downtown development district.
Correct, that's a typo. I will fix the typo. Do you want me to read through the language, or do you?
No, I don't think so.
Alright. So, page 77 starts the appeals language, and all of this is going to change. Because you have changed the appeal structure. So appeals of permits issued by the board will now go to the Supreme Court, so I am going to take out all this language and make that change.
Brilliant.
And that gets us to page 96.
Yeah.
But we still have new language to look at.
Right.
That'll
Yeah.
take the place of this.
That's gonna take long.
Yes. It's only 15 pages. I have already drafted. Well, it's a trade-off of about, it's like 30 to 15, so it's, all things considered, it's, in terms of time. Alright, so page 96, this is the new river permits language. On page 97 is where the new language is added to the statute. And I apologize because I don't remember if this has it or if the new, I'm going to be adding the language from Mike Klein about he wanted to add a phrase related to, I can't remember if I already added it in this or not. If you want me to check really quickly. he wanted to add language around inundation, and let me just see.
Fluvial? Did you have a fluvial? Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Sorry. Okay, so you heard from Mike Klein. He wanted to add the phrase. Okay, this does have Mike Klein's language in it. So he added the phrase starting on line 6. Highest priority river corridors are those that provide critical floodwater storage or flood energy dissipation, thereby protecting adjacent and downstream lands and property that are highly vulnerable to flood-related inundation and erosion.
Line 7, I would encourage us to say that provide, or have the potential to provide critical flood storage. There may be some degree of degradation that has occurred where we've given the river the time to heal itself.
Which would be,
Yeah, it may still be slightly degraded.
it's that provide or have the potential to provide. That way.
Yep.
Really.
Okay.
Good catch.
All right. Page 99 has the racial equity review section. We haven't talked about this in a while, but you did hear from Mark Hughes on this language.
Wait, what about page 98?
Oh, did you want to talk? So nothing. The rest of this hasn't changed.
Why are we inserting a beginning November 1, 2014?
Because the joint proposal wanted to add that phrase.
Yeah, so I need to know why though. Like, I don't.
Because that's when this, I think that's when the statute was enacted. I mean, I don't know if it's necessary, but.
Exactly, as we were going through and there's a staggered implementation for other permitting processes. To some degree, if you may be fine leaving A the way it is, I defer to Ellen on that. As we went through, I think there was just a question about whether we need to clarify. It was vague, and there was a recommendation to put that in. I think you'd probably take it out upon
It
reflection.
just seems kind of confusing.
It,
Usually we take out those kind of dates once.
No, I know, once they've actually come and passed, so I agree, I think you can take it out or not, have that there.
Like, take it out.
Great. Do you want me to read through the rest of this language?
Yeah, I mean, well, yes.
Sure. So starting on line 19, beginning on November 1, 2021, a person shall not commence construction of a development or subdivision that is subject to a permit under Chapter 151 of this title, Act 250, without a permit issued pursuant to the rules required under subsection A of this section by the Secretary, or by a state agency delegated permitting authority under subsection G of this section. Beginning November 1, 2023, a person shall not commence or conduct a use located in a highest priority river corridor without a permit issued pursuant under the rules required under subsection A of this subsection by the Secretary or by a state agency delegated permitting authority under subsection G of this section.
Great, so I thought the rules were promulgated November 1, 2022. How is this relate? I think I asked the same question last time. How does this jive with that?
So that those are for C. And then the 2022 rules are for C, which doesn't go into effect until 2023.
I don't see a C.
Line 3 of page 99.
So this is, sorry, this is for what?
Yep, that's for setting up this permitting system for highest priority river corridors.
Okay. Wait, so but, yeah, okay. Setting up rules. Sorry, I think I'm losing it.
Sure, right, so back on, so I did skip over some language. So there are rules required under subsection A that are already in existence. And so that's what subsection B is referring to. And then there is an additional rulemaking to set up the highest priority river corridors, and that's in subsection C. So there's two separate things happening.
But they both say highest priority river corridors, rules.
No. So the rules in sub A are for flood hazard areas.
Or river corridor. Please. What, when you say sub, alright, 97, page 97?
Mm-hmm.
Within a flood hazard area or a river corridor, on or before shall adopt rules, highest priority river corridors. Okay.
Yep, and so that's for the 2023 permit requirement.
Okay.
Yep. And so the 2021 refers to back on page 96, which is existing language.
Oh, I see. Okay, thanks.
Good job. We're getting cheered.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They know we're almost done.
Yeah. They're cheering us on.
It'll be a
The
gauntlet.
finish line.
It's out, probably. When we leave, it'll be a gauntlet out there. We'll make
Okay.
it through. We'll get patted on the back, so.
Racial equity review.
Yeah.
That looks great.
You want me to read through it?
Yeah.
Pursuant to the duties and powers established under 3 VSA Chapter 68, the Executive Director of Racial Equity, in cooperation with the Racial Equity Advisory Panel and the Human Rights Commission, shall conduct a comprehensive review of the processes, procedures, and language of Act 250 to assess the extent to which Act 250 has contributed to the adverse impacts on racial equity and diversity within the state. The review shall identify the impacts of acts or decisions made pursuant to Act 250 on inequities in land ownership and land distribution within the state, measure the extent to which minority populations in the state have incurred disproportional environmental impacts due to acts or decisions of the state pursuant to Act 250, assess the capability of the current public participation processes, notice requirements, and appointment processes under Act 250 that fairly represent the interests of minority populations within the state, and recommend legislative changes to Act 250 necessary to achieve the goals of racial equity and diversity representation for minority population.
So,
Or the minority population.
Populations
Sure.
as well.
On or before October 15th, 2020, the Executive Director of Racial Equity shall report to the General Assembly with its findings and any recommendations for legislative action.
that seems like a really unrealistic.
Yep, it is.
Well, you know, this is an old draft.
Well, yeah, but even if it's July 1, this went into effect.
Yeah.
And
July, October
There's no
15th.
way.
A couple things, on the previous page 99, I had a note home ownership, so on line 18, inserting home
Yep.
ownership as well. And then, it's unclear to me, and I know Mark was gonna follow up with Susanna Davis, who did come in, but it's unclear if she actually had a chance to review this language.
Yeah.
Something happened there, so, we'll make sure we circle back with her since we're charging this to her. And then what's a more realistic date?
I think 2 years out. I think this is
Do
a
you
lot.
want, yeah, it's a lot.
2022 seems to me to be reasonable.
Oh,
That's just
okay,
my
we'll try that on, let's ask her also.
All right.
2022, how do people feel about this section?
It's a lot.
Jim?
2022 will be the second year of the next biennium.
Yeah.
And I would like to have it the first year of the next
Yeah.
biennium,
Okay.
giving us time to digest it and what have you.
That's a great suggestion. Let's try that.
Majorly overhaul Act 250
At least it's
again.
another, it's a year and a, it's probably a year.
It's gonna be.
And maybe what were you gonna say?
They don't.
That's what you're gonna say? Okay, Gary.
I had put a request in to modify our language of environmental justice definition, and I don't know if we were able to interpret that, but I can send you the language. I know we were waiting for Mark Hughes and his comments, but we haven't probably received that. So I'll just send you my suggested language on environmental justice.
I'm a little confused because we went through environmental justice today.
And I had, the first time we went through it a week or two ago, I had mentioned it as how, when Mark was testifying and Susanna were. And I ran that language by them, but they were going to get back to us. And I just think that our language is limited. What I talked about is the right to equal environmental protection under the law and the right to live, work, and play in communities that are safe, healthy, and free of life-threatening conditions. And that came from Columbia University's environmental justice framework. And so, I just didn't want to lose sight of that.
That's in the definition section.
Right.
And how would it relate to the criteria that we reviewed today?
So, currently I only used the words environmental justice in the section header because using it in a sentence is difficult. So it would just be in the interpretation of that criteria.
Okay.
So yes, we can amend it in however you would like, but it's just in the section header of the criteria.
Okay. How do folks feel about Carrie's proposed? I don't remember the previous one, frankly, but I guess we'll try that on.
Try it on.
Try it on,
Thank
yeah.
you.
I love trying it on.
5:30, we get to trying on a lot.
I'll let them send
I mean, you know,
Okay.
send me some more words to add 5:30. Yay!
We're trying to make up the 15 pages.
No, I know. We lost all these pages. Let's add some more words.
Nope, that's not. Okay.
Great. So, you know, the rest of this stuff.
I was going to suggest we call this the Environmental Review Board. Not verb, but Environmental Review Board. Environmental Board. Environmental Board or Environmental Review Board. I mean, you can still just say board throughout.
Oh, okay.
What?
I think Verb is such a cute name.
Got baggage.
It's got baggage.
Yeah, all
Verb's
right,
got
baggage,
baggage.
but only to us, it will be done with its baggage.
I don't know if I have Wi-Fi right now. I'm not getting. Okay. Right. So that's the next thing is
Them.
verb. What do you want? I
I
mean,
like it.
Where are we exactly?
so on line 11, we're in section 19 of page 100. This is the revision authority. So, yeah, the first iteration of your board was called the Environmental Review Board.
Because I'm getting, I'm getting confused. So I'm maybe I'm looking ahead. But section 21 is
Don't look ahead.
okay.
What is that?
Environmental Review Board budget positions.
Well, right.
Right.
So this is just the beginning of that.
It's authority.
But everywhere else it says Vermont Environmental Review Board.
Okay, let's just work
I
through
get
this.
that it's got baggage from the other thing, but I think it's very nice because it shows action and everything. And really, it's insider thing. Only the insiders will know there was a change, but everyone else will say verb, and it's nice.
Insiders are the ones that are voting on it.
Well, we'll have to explain it, and they'll have to hold it in their heads. We've had to
That'll
do
work
this
well.
whole bill. They can hold that in their heads for just 2 seconds. I like the name. I like the name.
Let's
Okay.
focus.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. All right.
I do. I like the
So-
Awesome. I'm glad.
So So I guess if you would like a counterpoint to that.
Okay, go ahead.
The counterpoint is that the original proposal did something different than what the Natural Resources Board does currently. It was looking at both Act 250 permits and environmental permits from A&R. Your board is not going to be doing that, it's just going to be doing Act 250. The other thing is, so you should contemplate, if you want to change the name, you will have to change all of the signs and such.
Oh, you mean
What
from
sign?
natural resources?
Yeah, you know, like the sign down the street on their building.
Oh, no, let's not change.
Let's keep it
Let's do it.
Right, so that was the contemplation when it was becoming a different program.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah,
but that is absolutely a policy decision.
Alright, let's not
I hate
get,
to
we
waste
decided
the
the other
money.
day to say Natural Resources Board, let's
Yeah,
just call it.
let's just do that. Okay.
Moving along.
Alright,
Where we at?
so other things are very sort of ticky-tacky. Do you want me to be able to reorganize the definition section of Act 250?
To be alphabetical?
To be alphabetical.
Yes.
Yes.
Alright, so we'll leave that in. And then a lot of this doesn't apply. Like, I'm not gonna change 220 to 219 because,
Can you tell us where you are?
oh, I'm now on page 101. So a lot of this doesn't apply because you're not changing the appeal structure of the E-court. So, on page 101, we don't need to do line 3 to 4 because you're not gonna change the name of the board. We're not gonna be changing, chapter 220 to 219, so we don't need to do that. And I'm gonna check all the cross-references for the appeals to make sure that the things go to the environmental division of the correctly and what goes to the board. So then, the other thing on line 13, so we add the sort of shorthand titles to each of the criteria. So criterion 4 that we never talked about, that's soil erosion, capacity of land to hold water. 6, educational services. 7, local governmental services. We're gonna delete line 18 because you're deleting partial findings. 19, temporary improvements for TV or film, and then stay of construction might also be deleted.
What's partial finding?
That's the current expedited process that's available to downtowns. So,
And stay of construction is, you have to stop if it's in appeal,
yeah.
and we're deleting that.
Yeah.
If something's under appeal, it can go forward with construction.
Well, it's just gonna be moved.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's gonna be F I'm not sure if it's F anymore. I have to check.
We're deleting the concept.
Right, no, I'm not, but it might not be there. It might be somewhere else. Rules, I don't think we need this anymore because this is changing the name of the rules so that they go with the verb. And then, environmental review board budget, we don't need this because we're not gonna be changing the appropriations to the verb. Environmental division, I think we're probably gonna keep this because this says that any appeal started in the environmental division will stay there until the board is set up. And so we should pick a date as to when that will be. It's currently February 2021, or 2020. So you have
Missed
to,
that one.
oh yeah. So we gotta, this is when this is talking about the transition period, so.
And that transition was laid out in the joint proposal language, right? So that
Okay.
should be covered there,
Sure.
and we'll just have to look at it.
Okay. Alright,
Alright, where you go, team?
Effective dates.
effective dates. So, we haven't talked about effective dates really, and, you know, does anyone have any thoughts on the effective dates? Do you wanna just, move it out a year. So the bulk of this, so Section 18, which is the racial equity review, that takes effect on passage, so that it will start immediately. And then the remainder takes place on February 1, 2020, unless you, so if you want to kick that out 1 year or to a different date, and it also requires appointments be made to the board on or before December 15th, 2019, so.
So the joint proposal went through a fairly detailed summary of sort of effective dates and what became effective when. It's not horrifically different than this, but I think the important thing is that the ability to name people to the board and start the judicial nominating process start effectively as soon as possible, so that application process can start, so that the judicial nominating process can be hopefully complete as soon as possible. Let's see.
Thank you.
And there are some other sort of, like, I think you should think about, there's potentially several rulemaking requirements, and whether it's the several rulemaking requirements, and it's a question of whether you want the existing board doing it or the future board doing it, as far as amending procedural rules to make sure that they are accessible to citizen participation, other sorts of things that we included that we think are important, but it's a question of who.
Yeah. Do you? I haven't looked at it in a while.
It is the rulemaking on or before the 22nd November 2022.
So, what did you ask, Karen?
I was just looking at the rulemaking dates, but yeah, I appreciate getting this stood up sooner than later, especially because it's tied to staffing needs and how we're going to cover those costs.
The initial terms staggered.
Yeah.
Can't all be 6-year terms.
Yeah, and this describes that.
They're
in here.
6-year terms.
Oh, they're 6-year terms. Okay, good.
Which is, I think we need to talk about that actually.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at these dates, but it seems.
Okay, I think we let Ellen do that, and
Great.
we say this is great. Thank you all for staying late and persevering Tuesday night. Have a great evening.
Save me.